Okay, so welcome to this first lecture for Human Growth and Development. Uh, we're going to be going over the second PowerPoint, PowerPoint B for this lesson, because in our first class we kind of already touched on all of the content for PowerPoint A, which was just basically an overview of the class, and we did that in the WIMBA session. So, like I say, we're going to be going over PowerPoint B this time, which is going to be covering kind of a broad overview of uh, what developmental psychology is. All right, so week one, PowerPoint B. So, what is developmental psychology? Broadly speaking, it is how we get from here to here. It's how we grow. It's what impacts us as we grow. What is normal as we grow. How did we get the way we are? And what's normal for our particular development? And is that different from other people? It typically is. um, what factors shape us? What aspects change us as we grew up? The objectives for today are going to be to go over the questions and kind of try to formulate some answers to those. Well, that's actually going to kind of be the objective of the entire class. And we'll kind of get into more theories as we go along. All right. But today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about controversies in developmental psychology that keep kind of popping up. And we're going to be talking about the means by which developmental psychology is studied, theories, the techniques, the research. Okay? So, in particular, we're going to be talking about the controversies of the nature-nurture controversy, the continuity versus discontinuity controversy, and the universal versus context-specific controversy. And we're going to be talking in terms of research, we're going to be talking about the roles of theories and particular scientific methodological behavior, or not behaviors, things that we can do to study developmental psychology. So what is the nature-nurture controversy? I think if any of us have been in the sciences for long enough, we've probably experienced or at least been introduced to this controversy. And it's basically asking, are we all genetic or are we all impacted by environment? So which one is more, genetics or environmental nurture or our surroundings or our context in which we grow up? Is it more important? And if you've had any time to become familiar with this controversy, you've probably learned that most researchers have now kind of come to the conclusion that, okay, it's not just genetics, it's not just environment, it's both. All right. So how my environment impacts my genetic makeup contributes to who I am. Yeah. So an example of this would be the skin tone versus social expectation effects. So, for instance, if we have somebody who appears to be of Middle Eastern descent come into our therapy room, uh, what are we going to assume about this person? What sort of natural assumptions come to our mind? Oh, well, he might have come from a war-torn country. He or she might have different familial values. Um, but is that necessarily the case? This is we're assuming that based upon what they look like, and based upon what they look like, what we expect of them. But perhaps they're, the third generation uh, of an uh, Middle Eastern immigrant family. We don't know. That would mean that they're pretty much have a Western cultural understanding. I'm sure that their parental environment probably still impacts their, understanding of cultural values and whatnot. So perhaps it's kind of an intermingling of Western versus Eastern values. Who knows? We don't. That's why we have to ask the question. Continuity versus discontinuity. So you're going to see a lot of this with like the differences between Piaget's theories and Erickson's theories, for instance. Piaget kind of had an idea that we progress in stage, stage, and then there was no real growth or development in between those stages. It was kind of a boom, 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 stepwise sort of thing. We'll talk about that in a second. I've got a little graphic here. Versus Erickson, who kind of said, okay, there's a little bit of a gray area here. Middle adulthood may overlap somewhat for some people with later adulthood, or even early adulthood. Yeah. Such that, okay, well, what does it mean to be an early adult? What if the middle adult kind of is in a transition in their career or something like that? They could re-experience aspects of early adulthood. So he was very aware that it was a continuous, almost nebulous sort of progression through life, and it's very individual for Erickson how these things occur. So, is it the caterpillar becoming a butterfly, or is it the acorn becoming a sprout and becoming a tree? That's something for any psychologist to decide, and it's still kind of up in the air. But a lot of times, it's easier to understand. It's easier to kind of make a theory and say, okay, let's just put this person in a box. It's easier to understand the person if they're in a box. But if you're looking at them from a more individual perspective, then it's probably more accurate to look at them from a continuous perspective. Okay, so discontinuous makes it easier to conceptualize and understand a person, but discontinuous is more realistic, I would say, to what real people go through. So the continuous versus discontinuous. Discontinuous, stepwise, right? Continuous is more gradual. Now you've also got things such as that are called the inverted U or the U-shaped function. Inverted U is pretty easy to understand. Let's talk about it in terms of like memory functioning. As we are a child, we have very little memory. We have a poor memory ability, but it develops over time until it kind of starts to peak and then begins to decline as we get older. Whereas the U-shaped function, that's kind of an unusual function. You don't typically see that too often. The only example I can really think of right this second off the top of my head is marital satisfaction. In the beginning, you kind of got that honeymoon phase. Maybe around here you have kids, and then, your marital satisfaction kind of begins to wane, kind of begins to diminish until the kids, leave the house and you retire. And then all of a sudden your marital satisfaction increases. That's actually been shown in the research to occur. Now, there are other factors that contribute to that, and we'll kind of touch on those later in middle adulthood and early adulthood. But that's kind of an example to use for that. So, writers, historians, early sociologists, they all understood that there are stages in life. Even early Hebrews understood this. In Jeremiah, you have a variety of words to describe the different age groups. Shakespeare even got into the act, talking about the infant. And actually, he brought it around at the very end to having a second childhood. But in between, you've got various roles that Shakespeare devised in his plays. Now, this slide, I want you to note real fast that this was devised in 1979, this theory of Christian development, okay, by Whitehead and Whitehead. Now, why is that important? Take it with a bit of a grain of salt at this point, because the theory and our understanding of growth and development has advanced since then. Okay, it's been over 40 years since this theory was proposed. So, again, consider that when looking at this. So, what does this theory say by Whitehead and Whitehead? It says that there is either a natural process or an unnatural process to growth in Christians. The natural process aspect suggests that, okay, we are all good. That's its theory of human nature. We are all good. The unnatural process suggests humans are bad. The innate nature of humanity is negative. It's bad. It's sinful. Okay? So if our innate nature is all good, then God basically cultivates that goodness. He basically has something to work with instead of having to implant or uh, uh, place goodness within us. It sees hate and sin as aberrations, as aspects of the fall, not necessarily as innate qualities that we possess to begin with. Whereas the unnatural process of Christian growth, it suggests that we do have that innate sin quality. And it says that God has to actually overcome that sin in order to, through His grace, in order for us to be able to grow, in order for us to be able to progress in our Christianity and our faith and our walk. In other words, this is the difference between improving and transforming the person. Give some consideration to what you consider on that, because, we're all coming from different perspectives, different faith backgrounds, a different understanding of God and faith and Christianity. Our interpretation of the Bible is probably completely different from, what mine is or what, the person down the street is. So my understanding of this could be completely different from yours. Something to think about. So another controversy that constantly comes up is the universal versus context specific. And we've already touched on that with the example of the Middle Eastern client coming into our office. But in development, there are very few universals. Some people used to think that there were universals in development, such as, what's an example? Piaget's theory is considered a, quote, universal theory, in that everybody goes through it, everybody experiences this. Kohlberg's theory of morality, everybody goes through it. But is that necessarily the case? People from other cultures, they may not experience the same things we do. They may not have the same moral, well, I won't say they don't have the same moral values. I'm just going to say they may not have the same social norms that we possess. So yeah. So now we're going to start kind of touching on the goals of psychology and what it means to research, what it takes to research developmental psychology. So the goals of psychology are to describe, predict, and explain. So the way you do this is when you describe something, you observe it. Naturalistic observation, going out into the field and observing, how a child interacts with a Bobo doll, for instance. We predict through correlation, through regression analysis, and we explain through experiments. And if you take a research design class, you'll get into this much deeper. But for now, we're going to kind of skim the surface of this. All right? And ways to get there are either research or theories. We'll talk about that. So theories. What is a theory? Well, a theory is basically a skeleton. It's something that holds our assumptions together. It's something that organizes our world. It's a scaffolding. It's a way of organizing our thoughts about people, places, things, events, whatever. For example, the nature-nurture theory. Is it that, sorry, my screen went black. Is it that we are all genetic, or that we are influenced by our environment? That's a theory, depending on what you believe. Uh, do consequences influence success? That's a theory. That's behavioral psychology, essentially. Means to the answers: case studies, naturalistic observation, correlations, interviews, surveys. Psychology has a whole lot of different avenues to research, and that's why psychology is such a rich science. The scientific method is obviously used in psychology, and we're going to touch real quick on three aspects of research that could be used: cross-sectional versus longitudinal analyses, age versus cohort influences, and normative versus non-normative influences. Okay. So what is correlation? Correlation, basically, we compare two groups and we say, okay, is this, what sort of conclusions can we gather from our analysis here between these two groups? So is it that being smart leads to having more friends? Or is it that having more friends leads to someone being smart? Or could it be some third variable? Parents who are warm and supportive lead to people who are more smart and have more friends. Correlation, it shows us that there is a relationship there, but it doesn't really tell us everything about the relationship. Does that make sense? It basically shows us, okay, there is a connection here. Now let's do some more in-depth studies to kind of understand this connection. So one aspect that could be used to examine this connection more are cross-sectional versus and longitudinal research. Cross-sectional research basically is where you take somebody in this group, and a third group, and you say, okay, let's compare all these based upon this criteria. So will a child who is 10 years old, an adult who is 20 years old, or an adult who is 30 years old, how will they respond to this particular ethical vignette that we're going to propose to them? And comparing them. It's a comparison between age-related differences. The child would look at the ethical situation in one way. The adult who's 20 and the adult who's 30 would probably look at it in a completely different way. Longitudinal research, though, takes a look at the same group over a long period of time at multiple points along their age. So looking at the child who is 10 years old, giving him the ethical situation, waiting till he's 20, 30, 40, 50. It takes a long time to do longitudinal research. That's why you don't see it a lot. Or if you do see it, it's basically, maybe 20 years study or something like that. It takes a lot of dedication, a lot of time, a lot of resources, and that's why you don't see a whole lot of it. So, experimental design. So you've got the hypothesis. It's your theory as to what is going to happen. You've got the sample. It's the people, the individuals who are going to be recruited for your study and that you're going to put into groups. Let's jump down to experimental group because it's kind of the umbrella of these two here. Okay, the experimental group is the one that you're going to observe. It's the one that basically is the one that you're tweaking. Okay, whereas the control group is the one that you're not doing anything to and observing, to see if there are any changes. Now, in the experimental group, you have two groups. You have the independent group and the dependent group. Okay, the independent group is the one that you are manipulating. It's the one that you're tweaking some aspect. Okay, so for instance, It's the one where the child is shown a video of an adult hitting a Bobo doll. Okay? And then we're going to take a look at the dependent variable is the child's behavior after he's shown the video. Okay? Is the child going to hit the Bobo doll, hug it, ignore it? Who knows? So that's the experimental group. Now, the control group for this study wouldn't be shown the adult hitting the Bobo doll. And they would just be placed into the room with the Bobo doll and see what happens. Okay? So this is a very nice, confusing little graphic here. Make sense of it if you will. But it's just basically talking about the larger population, and from that you're pulling a little bit of a sample. You've got the control group, the experimental group, membership to which is randomly assigned. The experimental group receives the treatment, the control group does not, and you compare the DV, the dependent variable. Yeah. So, again, a theory. What does it do? I kind of got a little bit ahead of myself earlier. But the role of a theory is that it organizes data, and it suggests questions and answers. It says, okay, so if this is true, then what about that? Well, if it's true, then my theory would suggest that, oh, well, this would be true. But it may not be, so I have to test it. A theory is always falsifiable. Remember that. Various theoretical approaches that we see in psychological research: psychoanalytic theory, good old Freud, good old Jung, Erikson. Cognitive theory, from Piaget to Miller to a variety of individuals. Beck, for instance, focuses on thought processes and says that pathology is your thinking. Whereas psychoanalytic theory says that it's all unconscious and it's your past and your history that's impacting you. Whereas learning theory looks specifically at behaviors. It says, oh, well, you're doing this, so it has to be because you're being reinforced for doing that. So we use this sort of information to understand what is, quote, normal or abnormal. Okay? Is somebody's experiences, generally on average what we would expect from what we've seen by other people, and if not, is this causing some sort of negative aspect in their life, some pathology, some anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, things like that? Is this causing some negative thing to be occurring for them? And it helps us to identify neglected dimensions of development. So, is there some aspect that we as therapists can kind of give to our client in order to help them kind of move forward in their developmental process? Erikson talks about it, very, very similar to Freud. He talks about people becoming fixated or having a core pathology within a particular stage of his. Our job is to help integrate experiences that the person has had with perhaps the experiences that they haven't had. Give them new experiences. Give them a new understanding of themselves and of other people, and help them to kind of move forward in that developmental theory, or that developmental stage process. It aids in our understanding and increases our awareness of things. It helps us understand that, okay, not everybody is the same. People are individuals, certainly, but we can kind of understand them as being individuals within a context, within an environment where, okay, they are acting abnormally for this context. And it kind of makes us kind of have a radar for these sorts of things. And and we can use this information when we're working with others, or when we are taking a look at development in people. So, for instance, I've got two nephews who are identical twins, who are 4 years old. Their development is going to be substantially different than somebody who is not an identical twin, because they're always going to have their other brother with them. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they grow up relative to other kids. So let's give some consideration to this real quick. Jim was a 25-year-old firefighter in Cincinnati. On September 11th, 2001, he watched on television as the World Trade Center collapsed. He was so moved by the need to help his fellow firefighters that he went to New York to assist the rescue efforts. Jim now suffers from PTSD after the weeks of intense work and emotion that he experienced. So some questions that we should consider when we're working with Jim. How did his age, his profession, and his choices interact to bring him where he is today? If he wasn't a firefighter, would he have gone to New York? Would he have stayed there and helped those people? If he was 50 years old instead of 25, do you feel like he would have been motivated to go and leave his perhaps 3 children that he has instead of, being a bachelor, for instance, when he's 25? What impact might this have on his work, family, and his health? Does he have a family? Does he have a wife and kids when he's 25 years old? How is his health whenever he's 25? Is it, is he at the top of his game as a firefighter, or is he, did he maybe break his leg a couple of weeks ago? I don't know. How may these forces impact Jim's future job choices, his marriage, his feelings about political and racial issues? What might he think about, people from the Middle East now that he's been there and seen the devastation that these Taliban insurgents caused? How would he want to stay as a firefighter? Would it bring back recurring memories of the devastation and trauma that he's experienced in New York? I don't know. These are things that when Jim is sitting across from us, we need to kind of assess for and understand and respect in Jim, because he has unique experiences that have impacted how he is approaching life and understanding his world. We pull in psychology even more and more as research progresses and grows and accumulates. There's more and more of a biopsychosocial, spiritual understanding of humanity as a whole. This is a holistic theory. Okay, this takes a look at all aspects of humanity. Now, it's a very broad theory. Biopsychosocial theory is very broad, so sometimes it's very confusing and difficult to understand every aspect of a person that contributes to the self. Okay, so for instance, the psychological, the intellectual, temperamental, cultural versus school, family, biological could be genetic components, or the spiritual could be, their understanding of grace or sin. Theories of religious development, we're going to really touch more on stage theories of development, but what we talked about earlier was more of the transformational, the non-natural versus natural theory was more of a transformational theory. And transformational theories kind of say that God steps in and tweaks some aspect or manipulates some aspect about us and changes us from within. Stage theories, though, talk about cognitive development. They talk about development across the lifespan and say, okay, there are certain stages that people progress along in their faith development. We're going to specifically be talking about Fowler. We're going to be talking about him later on in the class, and his theory is one that I really encourage you guys to try to understand and learn about. Okay? Not right now, though. We'll get into it. Attachment theory. Now, there's a professor here at Regent named Dr. Moriarty, and he does what's known as God image research. And basically, what that says is it's sort of a psychodynamic theory in nature, saying that our early attachments impact how we view and understand God and relate to God. So the socialization theory, on the other hand, talks about how our environment impacts us and our culture impacts how we understand God. Are we going to have sort of a mystical Eastern understanding of religion and faith? Or are we going to have maybe sort of a Western Orthodox sort of understanding of faith? Depends on where we're at. So the developmental theory in basically, Wilhout and Titoni kind of summarized these various theories from Fowler, Piaget, Erikson, Kohlberg, and talked about how they impact or relate to religious development. Okay, and so things like how we think, or how we understand morals, or how our emotional development impacts our relationship to God. These are all aspects, again, biopsychosocial, biopsychosocial spiritual. They're all interconnected. They all relate to one another. So that's going to be the end for this slideshow presentation. That's it for week one. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get up next week's week two's PowerPoints, and I hope that this was informative for everybody and that you found it beneficial. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me, text me, call me, or we'll discuss it in the next WIMBA session. All right, guys. Well, good studies, and I hope that you have a great day.